Right now, along the shoreline of the largest reservoir in the United States, a white ring of mineral-stained rock stretches for miles above the current waterline. A permanent physical record of just how much water has disappeared from this lake over the past 2 decades. This week, that reservoir did something it has never done before in its entire 90-year history. It dropped lower than it has ever been recorded, lower than during the worst droughts of the 20th century, lower than the previous record set just 4 years ago, a record that, at the time, was already being described as historic. And as the water keeps receding, it's leaving behind exactly the kind of aftermath you'd expect from a lake giving up decades of secrets all at once. Sunken relics resurfacing, a shoreline that looks less like a lake and more like a bathtub. Someone forgot to refill, and a genuinely serious infrastructure crisis creeping closer with every foot the water level continues to fall. This is Lake Mead, formed in the mid-1930s when the Hoover Dam was built across the Colorado River, and for nearly a century, it has functioned as one of the most important pieces of water infrastructure in the entire American Southwest. The lake supplies water to more than 20 million people spread across Nevada, Arizona, California, and parts of Mexico, and it remains, alongside its sister reservoir Lake Powell further upstream, one of the 2 largest human-made bodies of water in the country. As of this past weekend, water levels at Lake Mead measured at roughly 1,040.3 feet above sea level, according to data published by the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation, the federal agency responsible for managing water resources across the western United States. That number might not mean much in isolation, but here's why it matters. The previous record low for Lake Mead was 1,040.58 feet, set back in July of 2022, a moment that at the time generated enormous national attention as receding waters revealed sunken boats, mining equipment, and in a story that captured headlines across the country, human remains in a barrel near the shoreline. This week's level dropped below even that previous historic low, meaning Lake Mead now sits at its lowest recorded point since the reservoir was first filled following the completion of Hoover Dam nearly a full century ago. To understand why this is happening now and why it's happening again so soon after the last record-breaking low just 4 years ago, you need to understand the specific set of conditions that have been building across the entire Colorado River basin over the past several years, culminating in what water managers are now describing as one of the most severe supply crises this region has faced in generations. Sarah Porter, director of the Kyle Center for Water Policy at Arizona State University, explained the immediate, proximate cause in fairly direct terms. There was very little snowpack across the region last winter, and the basin has just experienced one of the lowest runoff years on record. This detail matters enormously because the Colorado River, and by extension both Lake Mead and Lake Powell, doesn't primarily depend on rainfall for its water supply. It depends on snowpack, the accumulated snow that builds up across the mountains of Colorado, Utah, and Wyoming throughout the winter months, and then gradually melts throughout spring and summer, feeding a slow, steady flow of water down into the river system below. According to the U.S. Geological Survey, snowmelt can account for up to 75% of the total water supply in some western states, which means that when winter snowpack falls short, as it did dramatically this past year, there's simply no way to make up that deficit later in the year, regardless of how much rain might eventually fall. This most recent poor snowpack year didn't occur in isolation either. It landed on top of a more than 20-year downward trajectory that Lake Mead has been on, a sustained, multi-decade decline driven by what water researchers and climate scientists across the region have increasingly described as a genuine mega-drought affecting the entire American Southwest, compounded by steadily rising water demand from a growing regional population, along with warmer average temperatures that increase evaporation rates across the entire river system. This isn't a single bad year, producing a temporary dip that will simply correct itself once conditions normalize. It's the latest, most severe chapter in a long-running structural water crisis that has been building steadily since roughly the turn of the millennium. Now, let's talk about exactly what's actually visible right now, because this is where the story becomes genuinely tangible, the kind of thing you can see with your own eyes rather than simply read about in a water level report. As the lake has receded to this new record low, it has once again exposed what locals and park visitors have come to call bathtub rings, distinctive white bands of mineral deposits left etched into the rocky shoreline, physical visible markers showing exactly where the water level used to sit during fuller years. These rings aren't subtle. Visitors and photographers documenting the current conditions have described them stretching for a considerable distance above the current waterline, a stark, almost surreal visual reminder of just how much water has actually disappeared from this reservoir over the past 2 decades. Standing at certain overlooks around the lake right now, you're looking at a landscape that, from a purely visual standpoint, records its own decline directly into the surrounding rock, layer by layer, year by year. Beyond the bathtub rings themselves, the receding water has once again brought a familiar collection of objects back into view, many of which had already made headlines once before, back during the previous 2022 record low, and have now resurfaced again as water levels have dropped even further this year. According to reporting from local Las Vegas news outlets that visited the lake directly, an old intake pipe that once drew water out of the reservoir to help supply the greater Las Vegas Valley has become visible again above the waterline. A World War II-era swamp boat, a type of vehicle made famous for its use during the D-Day invasion of Normandy back in 1944, has similarly reemerged, sitting exposed where it had previously been submerged, a small island that had briefly reappeared during the 2022 low water period, then disappeared beneath the surface again as water levels temporarily recovered somewhat in the years since, has now resurfaced once more, another visible marker of just how directly and how physically responsive this landscape is to the lake's fluctuating water levels. It's worth being genuinely direct and honest about one specific detail here, because responsible reporting on a story like this means not overselling or sensationalizing what's actually being found, particularly given how much public attention the 2022 discoveries generated. Back in 2022, Lake Mead's dramatic drop revealed several sets of human remains, including a body found inside a barrel near the Hemingway Harbor area. Discoveries that generated an enormous amount of both local and national media coverage and speculation at the time. This year, despite water levels dropping even lower than that 2022 record, local news outlets that have specifically covered this year's resurfacing objects have noted directly that the level of public hysteria surrounding the 2022 body-in-a-barrel discovery has not repeated itself this time around. As of the most recent reporting available, this year's newly exposed objects have consisted of the kind of infrastructure and vehicle remnants described above, rather than any comparable discovery of human remains. This is worth stating plainly and clearly, both because it's simply the accurate current state of what's actually been reported, and because it would be genuinely misleading to imply otherwise, simply because it might make for a more dramatic story. What makes this particular moment considerably more serious than simply an interesting collection of resurfacing objects and dramatic shoreline photography is what's happening beneath the surface of the actual water infrastructure itself. And this is where the story shifts from visually striking to genuinely consequential for millions of people living across the region. Lake Mead's water doesn't just sit there as a static reservoir. It powers Hoover Dam's hydroelectric turbines, generating electricity that serves communities across Nevada, Arizona, and California. And it's this specific function that faces the most immediate, tangible risk as water levels continue their current decline. According to the most recent figures, Lake Mead is now approaching what's known as the 1,035-foot operational threshold, a specific elevation level at which some of Hoover Dam's turbines will be forced to shut down entirely, because the water level would become too low to maintain the pressure needed to keep those specific turbines operating. If and when that threshold is reached, the dam's overall electricity generation capacity would drop by a genuinely dramatic 70%. A July 2026 forecast issued by the Bureau of Reclamation indicates that Lake Mead's water levels could come close to that critical threshold within the next few months and could potentially fall below it entirely by sometime next spring. This isn't a distant, hypothetical, multi-decade concern. Based on the federal government's own current projections, this represents a genuine possibility within less than a year from right now. It's worth taking a moment to properly explain why this specific threshold matters so much, beyond simply the raw percentage figure of lost generation capacity. Hoover Dam's hydroelectric power doesn't just serve a small, isolated local community. It provides electricity across a genuinely wide swath of the American Southwest, and a 70% reduction in generation capacity would represent a significant, tangible loss of power supply for the broader regional grid, precisely during a period when electricity demand across this same region continues climbing, driven by population growth, increased data center construction, and rising average temperatures that push air conditioning usage higher across increasingly long, increasingly hot summer seasons. This isn't simply an abstract concern about a distant reservoir. It connects directly to the practical, everyday electricity supply that millions of people across multiple states depend on. This looming power generation threshold sits alongside an even more fundamental concern: the simple, direct question of water supply itself. For the more than 20 million people who depend on Lake Mead and the broader Colorado River system for their drinking water, agricultural irrigation, and municipal use. For years now, the 7 states that make up the broader Colorado River Basin, Arizona, California, Nevada, Colorado, New Mexico, Utah, and Wyoming, have been engaged in prolonged, often genuinely contentious negotiations over exactly how the river's increasingly limited water supply should be allocated and conserved going forward. These negotiations have repeatedly led to significant disagreements between the various states, and at various points have even involved explicit threats of litigation between states unable to reach agreement on their own. Given the persistent difficulty these states have had reaching a mutually acceptable agreement on their own, the federal government has stepped in more directly. Last month, federal officials put forward a specific proposal suggesting that the 3 states making up what's called the lower basin of the Colorado River system, Arizona, California, and Nevada, would need to accept meaningfully reduced water allocations going forward, a direct, federally initiated intervention responding to the increasingly urgent reality that voluntary state-led negotiations alone had not been sufficient to address the scale of the crisis currently unfolding. Interior Secretary Doug Burgum addressed this situation directly in a public statement, acknowledging the genuine seriousness and urgency behind the federal government's decision to intervene more directly in what has traditionally been a negotiation left primarily to the individual states themselves. To fully appreciate the scale of what's actually happening across this broader river system right now, it's important to understand that Lake Mead's record low isn't occurring in isolation. Lake Powell, the other major reservoir on the Colorado River system, situated upstream from Lake Mead near the Arizona-Utah border, has been experiencing its own extremely similar, closely related crisis simultaneously. As of the most recent measurements, Lake Powell's elevation was sitting at roughly 3,522 feet, edging closer to its own previous record low of 3,519.92 feet, a mark set back in April of 2023. Current projections suggest Lake Powell could also set a fresh record low sometime this month. Perhaps most strikingly, when you look at these 2 enormous reservoirs together, rather than treating them as entirely separate, isolated stories, the combined water level currently held across both Lake Mead and Lake Powell has tumbled to its lowest point since 1957, a year that predates even the completion of Glen Canyon Dam, meaning Lake Powell itself hadn't even finished filling with water yet at that point in history. In other words, the combined water storage capacity of the 2 largest reservoirs in the entire Colorado River system, taken together, currently sits at a level not seen since before one of those 2 reservoirs had even fully come into existence in the first place. A genuinely striking way of illustrating just how severe and how historically unprecedented the current situation across this entire river basin has actually become. Water researchers studying this broader crisis have used a particular useful metaphor to help explain exactly what these 2 reservoirs represent within the larger Colorado River system, and why their simultaneous decline matters so much for the entire region depending on that system. Lake Mead and Lake Powell function essentially as the region's savings account, a substantial reserve of stored water specifically designed to help buffer the broader Southwest against exactly the kind of prolonged drought years the region has been experiencing with increasing frequency and increasing severity over the past 2 decades. And, as with any savings account, years of drawing down that reserve faster than it can be replenished eventually leads to a genuinely depleted account. Precisely the situation researchers say this region now finds itself confronting directly. It's worth being clear and specific about the practical, tangible consequences this crisis carries for the millions of people whose lives and livelihoods depend directly on this water system, beyond simply the abstract, high-level policy negotiations happening between state and federal officials. Agricultural operations across Arizona, California, and Nevada depend heavily on Colorado River water for crop irrigation, and reduced water allocations translate directly into difficult decisions about which crops can still be planted, how much acreage can realistically be farmed, and in some cases, whether certain farming operations remain economically viable at all under significantly reduced water availability. Municipal water utilities across major metropolitan areas, including Las Vegas, Phoenix, and portions of greater Los Angeles depend on the same river system for a meaningful share of their overall drinking water supply, meaning continued reductions in available water directly shape ongoing conversations about water conservation measures, usage restrictions, and long-term infrastructure planning that residents across this entire region are increasingly likely to encounter and need to adapt to in the years directly ahead. Beyond agriculture and municipal water supply specifically, there's also a genuine economic dimension tied directly to tourism and outdoor recreation that deserves mention here as well. Lake Mead was formally designated as the United States' first national recreation area back in 1964, and its waters have drawn visitors for boating, hiking, fishing, and camping for decades since that original designation. As water levels continue declining, and boat ramps and marina facilities face increasing operational challenges due to the shrinking, retreating shoreline, the broader tourism economy connected to the lake faces genuine, direct disruption as well, adding yet another layer of real economic consequence to a crisis that extends well beyond simply water supply and hydroelectric power generation alone. Given everything laid out here, it's worth stepping back and asking directly, what happens next and what would it actually take to meaningfully reverse this multi-decade decline? The honest answer, based on everything water researchers and federal officials have said publicly about this situation, involves both near-term and considerably longer-term considerations that don't necessarily align neatly with each other. In the near term, meaning over the coming months, water levels at Lake Mead will likely continue tracking closely with whatever specific water release and conservation decisions come out of the ongoing negotiations between the lower basin states and the federal government, alongside how much water actually continues flowing downstream from Lake Powell and the broader upper basin, snowpack and runoff conditions feeding the entire system. If the federally proposed reductions for Arizona, California, and Nevada are ultimately implemented, that could help slow, though likely not immediately reverse, Lake Mead's continued decline, buying additional time before that critical 1,035-foot hydropower threshold is actually reached. Over the considerably longer term, meaningfully reversing this 2-decade downward trajectory would require multiple consecutive years of genuinely strong snowpack across the broader Colorado River Basin, a pattern that would need to break decisively from the pattern of below-average snowpack that has characterized so much of the past 2 decades across this region. Climate researchers studying long-term precipitation and snowpack trends across the American Southwest have generally been cautious, rather than optimistic, about the likelihood of that kind of sustained multi-year reversal happening naturally in the near future, given the broader, well-documented pattern of increasing aridity that has characterized this specific region over recent decades, a pattern many climate scientists connect directly to broader, ongoing shifts in global climate patterns. This combination of near-term policy uncertainty and considerably more uncertain, considerably longer-term climate and precipitation trends is precisely why water officials and researchers studying this crisis have generally avoided offering any confident, specific prediction about exactly when, or even definitively whether, Lake Mead's water levels might eventually stabilize or begin genuinely recovering, rather than continuing along their current multi-decade downward trajectory. What can be said with genuine confidence, based on the actual current data and the federal government's own most recent projections, is that the immediate months directly ahead carry real, tangible stakes, specifically regarding that critical hydropower generation threshold, and that the broader, multi-state negotiation process over how to allocate an increasingly scarce shared water resource remains very much unresolved and ongoing as this story continues to unfold in real time. Standing today at the shoreline of Lake Mead, looking out at those pale, mineral-streaked bathtub rings stretching for miles above the current waterline, at a resurfaced World War II-era swamp boat and an old drinking water intake pipe, sitting exposed to open air after years spent submerged, you're looking at considerably more than simply an interesting, visually striking collection of curiosities revealed by a shrinking lake. You're looking at the direct, physical, visible evidence of a genuine, ongoing infrastructure and water supply crisis affecting more than 20 million people. A crisis currently unfolding in real time, playing out through federal water allocation negotiations, through hydropower generation projections, and through a reservoir that just this week recorded its lowest water level in the entire 90-year history since Hoover Dam first began holding back the Colorado River back in the 1930s. The aftermath that new footage from Lake Mead is currently revealing isn't simply a collection of sunken relics resurfacing into daylight after years spent hidden beneath the water. It's a direct, visible warning about the increasingly fragile state of one of the most important water systems in the entire American Southwest, a warning being written, quite literally, into the exposed rock along an ever-shrinking shoreline, one additional foot of retreating water at a time.